Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going like way deep into Krzysztof Kieślowski's The Decalogue IX, and we're going to be looking at interpretations of the Ninth Commandment in the film. And you guys sent in some fascinating writings about this, desire, jealousy, all that good stuff, relationships, human relationships. So I'm really excited to unpack all this with you.
Yeah, this is a film that really gets under your skin. It's often called, the jealousy short, this installment of the Decalogue, and it really grapples with this idea of coveting in a way that goes way beyond like just simply wanting what belongs to somebody else.
Yes, and the source material we're looking at today focuses heavily on the relationship between Roman and Hanka, and there's this underlying tension like right from the start, even before any infidelity even comes into play. So what's going on there?
Well, right off the bat, Roman receives this life-altering diagnosis, right, impotence, and this news really hits him hard. And it's not just about the physical aspect of it. The source material really emphasizes how this diagnosis creates this profound sense of lack in Roman's life. It challenges his masculinity, his sense of self-worth, and ultimately his place in the world.
So it's interesting how this lack becomes almost like a driving force in the film.
Yeah.
We see how it affects Roman's perceptions of his wife Hanka and his interactions with Ola, his young patient.
Absolutely. And you see the sense of lack. It isn't just about sex. It taps into this much deeper human experience. I think we all crave things we feel are missing in our lives, whether it's success, love, validation, even just a sense of belonging. And that yearning can sometimes lead us down, a dark path, making us covet what others have, just like Roman does.
And that's where the Ninth Commandment comes into play, right? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. But the source material argues that Kieślowski isn't offering a simplistic interpretation here. Like, it's not just about avoiding adulterous thoughts. It's much deeper than that.
Exactly. He seems to be exploring the root of coveting. He's asking us to examine those feelings of lack that drive our desires and how they can manifest in these destructive ways, like jealousy and suspicion.
And it's fascinating how this all plays out in Roman's reaction to Hanka's affair. Like, it's not so much anger that he feels, but rather, as the source material points out, a deep sense of guilt and shame. It's almost as if her infidelity confirms his deepest fears about his own inadequacy.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. His sense of lack makes him suspicious, and when those suspicions are confirmed, it reinforces his feelings of inadequacy, creating this like vicious cycle. And it's not just about the affair itself. Remember, Roman even says that spying on Hanka was stupid, hurting both of them.
Right, that moment really stuck with me too. He seems to recognize that his actions are driven by his own insecurities, not just by Hanka's behavior. So we have this really complex portrayal of a man wrestling with his own demons. And then we're introduced to Ola, who seems to represent a completely different perspective on desire.
Yeah, Ola's story is so intriguing, isn't it? Here's this talented young singer who chooses to live this simple life. She tells Roman, I just want to live. Living is enough for me. It's almost like she's embodying the opposite of what Roman is going through. She finds contentment in the present moment, accepting her limitations and not yearning for what she lacks.
It's such a stark contrast, and I think that's what makes her character so compelling. She challenges the very notion of coveting by finding fulfillment in the simple act of living.
Exactly. It raises the question, is it possible to live a life free from coveting? Can we truly be content with what we have, or are we always striving for something more?
That's such a great question, and I think it's one that Kieślowski wants us to grapple with throughout the film. But then we have Ola's tragic death during surgery, which adds another layer of complexity to this whole idea of contentment and acceptance.
Yeah, it's a heart-wrenching moment, and it certainly complicates things. Does her death undermine her message of finding joy in the present, or does it simply highlight the fragility of life, reminding us to appreciate each moment even more?
And this is where I think the film really starts to dig deep into the nuances of the Ninth Commandment. It's not about offering a simple moral judgment. It's about forcing us to confront these uncomfortable truths about our own desires and the fleeting nature of life.
You're absolutely right. And we see this play out further as the film progresses, especially in the way Roman continues to struggle with trust and insecurity, even after Hanka ends her affair.
Let's dive into that dynamic a little more in part two. It's clear that even though Hanka returns to Roman, there are still deep wounds that need to be healed.
Yes, and we'll also explore how this enigmatic composer, Van den Boedenmeijer, whose music plays such a significant role in the film, adds another layer to this exploration of desire and longing.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Decalogue IX. So before we jump back into like the complexities of Roman and Hanka trying to, reconcile their relationship, I think it's worth talking about a character who's like not physically present, but whose presence is like this huge weight over the entire film, the composer Van den Boedenmeijer.
Yes, Van and Buddha, his music is almost like a character itself, isn't it? This mysterious figure who, never seen on screen, but who seems to have this profound impact on the other characters,
Yeah.
especially Ola.
And what's so fascinating is that Van and Boodmeyer is actually this fictional character that Kieślowski created specifically for the Decalogue series, and yet his music, composed by Zbigniew Preisner, feels so real. It has this deep emotional resonance that adds another dimension to the film's exploration of desire and longing. And the source material points out something really interesting. Kieślowski himself said that, in his mind, Preisner was Van den Boodmeyer. There seems to be this deep connection between the actual composer and the themes that the film is wrestling with.
It's like there's this hidden layer of meaning woven into the fabric of the film, and it's through Ola, the character who embraces contentment and acceptance, that we're introduced to Van Boodmeyer's music. Remember, she describes it to Roman as something pure, untouched by, the anxieties of desire.
It's like she's offering him this glimpse into a different way of experiencing the world, a way that transcends those feelings of lack that are tormenting him. The music becomes this symbol of something deeper, something beyond just the material realm.
That's a really insightful observation. I think you're right. It's as if Van den Boodmeyer's music represents this kind of spiritual or emotional state that Roman yearns for but just can't quite grasp. Remember that scene where Roman listens to the music after Ola's death?
Yeah, that scene always gets, to me, it's so heartbreaking, but there's also this sense of peace, almost like he's trying to connect with something larger than himself, something that transcends the pain of loss.
Yeah, and it speaks to the power of art, right, to provide solace and meaning in the face of despair. But shifting gears a bit, let's circle back to Roman and Hanka for a second. The source material notes that despite Hanka choosing to end her affair, Roman still really struggles with his insecurities and his inability to fully trust her.
Yeah, their attempt at reconciliation is so fraught with tension. It's like, even though Hanka comes back, the damage has already been done. Roman's sense of lack and the betrayal that he feels makes it so difficult for him to move forward.
And this is where the film's ending, I think it's really interesting. You see this kind of echo of the beginning and the end with those phone calls, right? The first phone call at the start of the film is so full of deceit, and it really sets the stage for Roman's descent into jealousy. But then the final call with Hanka rushing back after seeing her former lover, although it's a misunderstanding, it hints at this glimmer of hope.
Yeah, it's like this full circle moment, but with a shift in the dynamic. Instead of secrecy and suspicion, there's this sense of urgency and perhaps even a genuine desire to reconnect.
The source material also highlights the setting of this final scene, the hospital room, this place that's associated with healing and recovery. It really reinforces the idea that both Roman and Hanka are on this journey towards, mending not just their relationship, but also their own internal wounds.
So if we connect this back to the Ninth Commandment and everything we've been talking about with desire and coveting, what can we take away from this film? It's clearly not this simple condemnation of, wanting what we don't have.
I think Kieślowski is challenging us to look deeper, to examine the roots of our desires and how those desires shape our actions. Desire can be destructive, like we see with Roman's jealousy and suspicion, but it can also be this source of connection and inspiration, like we see through Ola's love of music.
And ultimately, the film seems to suggest that true fulfillment doesn't come from chasing after these external things. It's about finding the sense of peace and acceptance within ourselves and in our relationships.
Exactly. It's a journey that requires honesty, self-awareness, and a willingness to confront our own vulnerabilities. And that brings us to one final point that the source material raises. What if Roman hadn't survived his suicide attempt? Would his lack have ultimately defined his life?
That's such a powerful question, and it really ties into the ambiguity of Hanka's return. Was it fueled by genuine love and this desire to rebuild their connection, or was it driven by guilt and this fear of being alone?
These are the questions that Kieślowski deliberately leaves unanswered, and it's like he's inviting us to ponder, the complexities of human motivation and the lasting impact of our choices.
It's this ambiguity that makes the Decalogue IX such a thought-provoking film. It's one that really stays with you long after the credits roll.
Absolutely, and it's a perfect example of how Kieślowski's films encourage us to engage in these deeper philosophical reflections about the human condition. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more element I think we need to explore, the recurring motif of the gaze in the film.
The gaze, it's such a prevalent theme in Kieślowski's work, and it's definitely a play in the Decalogue IX. The source material points out all these instances of characters looking at each other through windows and mirrors and other barriers. it creates this unsettling feeling of being observed, almost like we're peering into their private lives.
Yeah, it's almost voyeuristic, isn't it? And I think that's intentional on Kieślowski's part. The gaze becomes this metaphor for how we scrutinize and judge not only others, but also ourselves. And it's especially prominent, I think, in the context of Roman and Hanka's relationship, where trust has been broken and suspicion is kind of lingering in the air.
Right. It makes me think about how those feelings of lack we talked about earlier can really distort our perceptions.
Mhm.
Roman's insecurity fuels this need to watch, to control, almost like he's trying to possess Hanka through his gaze.
That's a really interesting connection. It's like he's seeking confirmation of his fears, which ultimately only reinforces that sense of inadequacy. And this ties back, I think, to the ninth commandment and this whole idea of coveting, right? It's not just about desiring what others have, but also about the ways in which we try to exert power and control over those we desire.
It's a really unsettling thought, and it makes the film feel so relevant to our world today, where surveillance technology and social media have really amplified this sense of constant observation.
Absolutely. Kieślowski's films have this uncanny ability to tap into these timeless human anxieties, and the motif of the gaze is like a perfect example of that. It speaks to our deepest fears about privacy and control and the ways in which our desires can be, manipulated and exploited.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Decalogue IX, what final thoughts do you want to leave our listener with?
I think it's important to remember that Kieślowski doesn't offer easy answers in this film. He presents us with these complex characters who are grappling with real human emotions, and he challenges us to really examine our own desires and motivations.
It's a film that encourages us to ask these difficult questions about ourselves and our relationships and the narratives we create about our own lives. And ultimately, I think it's a film about the search for connection and meaning and a sense of belonging in a world that often feels fragmented and isolating.
Beautifully said. It's a reminder that even in the face of our flaws and shortcomings, human connection remains this powerful force capable of offering hope and redemption, even in the most challenging circumstances.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Decalogue IX. We've explored the complexities of desire, the impact of lack on our relationships, the enigmatic presence of Van den Budenmeyer, and the haunting motif of the gaze.
It's been a really fascinating journey, and we hope our listener has found it insightful and thought-provoking.
Remember, the conversation doesn't have to end here. We encourage you to revisit the film, ponder the questions Kieślowski leaves unanswered, and continue to explore the depths of this rich and complex masterpiece.
Until next time, keep diving deep.